Hey clinical psych people, so I am going to use this video just to walk you through things for this coming week, the week where we're doing experiential therapies. And I'm going to start by walking you through Blackboard. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all. All right, so here on Blackboard, I will post this as an announcement once it's done. Just some gentle reminders for what's coming up. Paper assignment. The next thing that you have due is your 3 therapies. A lot of you have been writing me about this, which is great. Keep doing that. Keep asking me questions. So it is due tomorrow, Tuesday the 31st. If you need an extension, please let me know and we'll go from there. So you should talk about each of your 3 therapies in detail. Why would you pick that therapy for this particular person, especially considering this particular person's disorder? What research is there out there that backs up using this therapy for this disorder? And what would that therapy entail? What techniques would be used, particularly for someone with this disorder? So for example, if I were going to talk about someone I would treat with depression with CBT, I would talk about completely different techniques than someone who had an eating disorder with CBT. So make it specific to your disorder. Again, post through Blackboard. I recommend at least a page per therapy. To be written well, it might be more. So this is the longest section of your paper. It's why it's worth the most points so far. Next up, some videos and links that I really want you all to focus on this week. So this is divided into 2 sections this week, Existential and Gestalt therapy, just because my old book has these as separate chapters. So for Existential, I made a video walking you through Carlos's case study. And then I highly recommend watching these Yalom clips. Yalom is a very well-known therapist who worked a lot within this framework. So these are actually videos of Yalom, I believe with actors doing group therapy, but it still gives you a really nice indication of things. Then if we go back out and we look at Gestalt therapy, then we have Louisa's case study that I walk you through here. The video you absolutely have to watch this week is the Fritz Perls and Gloria one. So this is the same Gloria that we saw Rogers work with last week. So you get to see how Perls works with her. You get to truly see Gestalt therapy. And so you get some ideas there. Highly recommend that as well. So that being said, I'm going to walk you through the main concepts of Gestalt and existential therapy in a PowerPoint. Again, this is not ideal. This is not what I would typically do with you all, but this is the best way for me to make sure that you all are getting all the basic information you need to understand these types of therapy. So I apologize that this can't be as interactive as we typically like. So in terms of existential therapy, this comes out of a reaction against rationalism, science, and the Industrial Revolution. The purpose is to regain contact with the experience of being alive and aware. A lot of people felt after the Industrial Revolution that everyone was just sort of like part of the assembly line, that people weren't thinking for themselves. Existential comes from really existence, so X means out, and stare means stand, so stand out. And existential philosophers were sort of interesting in terms of how they thought about things. So the famous quote from Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was a French playwright, is "Hell is other people." Robert Browning says, "Take love away and our earth is a tomb." And Rollo May was a really well-known psychologist who was an existentialist. And in fact, there's a video of him talking about this on Blackboard as well. And it's, I am, therefore I. So it's not I think, therefore I am. I exist, existentialism, therefore. Now, in terms of dynamics of consciousness, this is really distinct from psychoanalysis that we've talked about so far. They thought consciousness was the most important. It's not unconsciousness. It's not subconsciousness. It is being aware of where you are and what's going. So being aware gives us power, lets us accept what we're experiencing, transcend that, and be sort of meta, be aware. And it engages us in the process of being or going against being. So an existential thought is to be and not to be. A little weird to think about, but this is actually something that will come up again when we look at dialectical behavioral therapy in the future. So they talk about authentic versus inauthentic living. The ideal in existential therapy is to live the authentic life. You want to basically not lie to yourself, be truthful, face world's harsh realities. Inauthentic living is where you just sort of go along with everything else. So freedom versus enslavement, courage versus cowardice. You have to have the courage to stand up, to realize that life's not great. A nice analogy for this is to think about The Matrix. Like if you've ever watched that movie, which I know seems old to y'all now, came out when I was in high school. But like the idea that you have to sort of break out of this world that isn't really the world, right? Responsibility versus selfishness, commitment versus alienation, and efficacy versus powerlessness. So really you have to step up, be responsible, accept responsibility for the things that are going on with you. So there are several different existential dilemmas that they talk about. Death is an existential dilemma. We're all gonna die. We all have to face up to it. Obviously with the COVID-19 issue now, that's even more apparent, right? It's really scary. And that's one of the reasons why the whole thing is just so scary for us. So the idea is we have to recognize we're going to die. And then the flip side of that is, what are we going to do with the life we're given? It's sort of YOLO. Okay. I don't know. Doesn't sound right coming out of my mouth. Freedom takes responsibility, right? It's a lot easier to just listen to someone else sort of blindly. But if you are free, you've got to accept responsibility for taking care of yourself. And then there's isolation and separation. I mean, we all literally have that right now, right? But the idea is that oftentimes we're missing human connection. And again, we have to sort of break out of that zombie-like, we're all on another brick in the wall, another cog in the wheel, to be able to connect with other people. And then meaninglessness and purposelessness, we often feel like this in our lives. And so you have to actually be willing to engage and figure out what you want to do. Now, one of my most interesting things I think about existentialism is this idea that oftentimes, let's say someone asks you to do something and you just really don't want to, right? You'll be like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't. I have to do homework." Existentialists would argue you should say, I won't go do that. That's a lot scarier, right? It's potentially alienating for people, but again, that's part of taking responsibility for your choices. So they talk about bad faith, which is ignoring these existential questions. So if you just try to pretend those don't exist, like I'm never going to die, I'll need to think about responsibility. This creates 3 life problems. So you're living a cowardly lie, you're going to be unhappy, and also, to be perfectly honest, it's just not possible, right? It's not possible to really ignore these. You have to face them. What is possible is not to choose, says Sartre. If I do not choose, I'm still making a choice. And so the word they really want people to strive for is authentic existence. This is the alternative to bad faith. It won't relieve loneliness and unhappiness. Again, this is not very positive, but they think that like every person is alone and doomed, and life has no meaning beyond what you give it. The essence of the human experience is understanding that you must die. So what they say you should do is ask, what does life want from me? And you should strive to better the human condition and give yourself some fulfillment that way. So parts of the experience, so there's a precursor to the parts of the experience, and that's design. And this is the understanding of what's going on. The best analogy for this, one of my professors in undergrad gave was one time he was telling his daughter when she was quite young, when kids will just sort of parrot things at this point. And he said, say I'm a turkey. And she said, she stopped and she looked at him and she said, you a turkey. And that's that moment of design, the realizing, oh, no, I'm processing this and I'm not going to do that. So they talk about the biological experience, that's the Umwelt. That is both the physical world around you and your internal experience of sensations. Your social experience is the Mitwelt, being with other people. And then the Eigenwelt is your psychological experience. And that's, again, what we would typically focus on in therapy. They talk about thrownness and angst. Thrownness is an important basis of your experience. It's essentially the moment and place and circumstances to which you are born. And existentialists argue that being thrown into modern society is particularly difficult because it is so alienating. And so, again, it's not so easy. And then angst, this is, again, if you've ever heard angsty, existential angst, that's this idea. Anguish, forlornness, despair. So our moral imperative, they say, is to face thrownness and angst directly instead of trying to ignore them. So the basic concept here is that it regards people as meaning-making beings. Again, how can I help the human existence, right? We're both subjects of experience and objects of self-reflection. Who am I? Is life worth living? Does it have meaning? How can I realize my humanity? Only in reflecting our morality can we learn to live. You have to come to terms with those questions that we talked about. And again, responsibility is a huge thing. We're responsible for who we are and for what we become. Now, in terms of therapy, they think that symptoms essentially are masking these existential crises, and that existential dilemma ensues from the existential reality that though we crave to persist in our being, again, we're all dying. We're finite creatures, right? We are thrown into existence with that predestined life structure and destiny, that thrownness we talked about, and each of us must decide, again, that responsibility comes up again and again, how to live as fully, happily, ethically, and meaningfully as possible. So here are those 4 categories of ultimate concerns. Freedom, we're the authors of our own life. And again, that's a really hard responsibility. We try to always put this off on other people. Well, I did this because he, she did that. But we really, truly are responsible for our own experiences. Isolation, interpersonal, intrapersonal, so from ourselves, existential. And then meaning, our ongoing search for substantial, purpose-providing life structures often throws us into crisis. It's hard to find meaning in life. And then the awareness of death. It's painful, but it also enriches life because it's like, what are we going to do with the time we're given? Now, in terms of what the role the therapist has, it's the fellow traveler. So you are not necessarily in charge as a therapist. You are a helper. So awareness of ultimate concerns as givens of existence produces a relationship between the therapist and the patient as just 2 people on this journey together. So they think labels like patient therapist, client counselor, is like a them and an us, and they don't like that. They think we're all in this together. No person is immune to this. The therapist is having to deal with all this too, right? So sharing the essence of the human condition is the bedrock of therapeutic work. So in this way, it's a lot like humanistic in some ways. They never really formed any institute. Really, you can apply this to any kind of therapy. They do their own reading. They're concerned with rediscovering the living person amid dehumanizing modern culture. And human-of-focus approaches to psychotherapy suffer in a climate of market forces. So existential focus concerns whether or not people are living as authentically and meaningfully as possible. And emotions and behavior may exist at different levels of consciousness. So you might be behaving in certain ways because you don't realize how you're actually feeling, if that makes sense. So in terms of psychodynamics, and literally psychodynamics translated to forces of the mind, the idea here is that basic conflict between the individual and the givens, the ultimate concerns of experience. Freud is drive, anxiety, leads to defense. Here in existentialism, it's you have awareness of what the ultimate concerns are. That leads to anxiety because it's very anxiety provoking to sit with these thoughts and these ideas. And then you might have defense mechanisms, and that's why you end up coming for therapy. A certain amount of anxiety is normal, inevitable, they say. Um, Freedom, again, I've mentioned responsibility a lot. It's a big thing in existential theory. You have to be willing um, and impulsive and compulsive, right? You need to think about those. Relationships showcase perils of merger and isolation, using and relating. Um, some people feel like, oh, well, I have to be compulsive in my sexuality, and that's how I'm going to get through things. Again, as I mentioned before, living necessitates meaning and values, and that can be terrifying, right? And to cope with terror of death, we erect defenses against death awareness, so we just don't let ourselves realize. So again, that's why when we come to something like what we're currently in, this global pandemic, it's really difficult because it stares us in the face that everybody does have to die at some point. Now, in terms of denial, individuals have deep, powerful beliefs in their personal inviolability, invulnerability, and immortality. Again, I think we can really see this in the people who are not social distancing, just going out and doing their normal thing. I used Liberty as an example, right? Jerry, what's his face, just said, yeah, come on back, it's fine. And now they have cases all over campus. At a deep unconscious level, we believe the ordinary laws of biology don't apply to us. We think that we're special and we'll override death, and that's how we camouflage our fears. And we might seek therapy when we realize, like, oh, I'm still anxious, something's going on, right? So we might have a belief that someone's watching over us and in a different world. It might be a human, it might be someone divine, whether that's God or whatever divinity you believe in. And it might result in you being passive, dependent, sort of not really caring to make your own decisions. And you might dedicate your life to finding this person and appeasing them rather than, again, taking responsibility for your own self. So here you view patients in a human way. A variety of techniques can be used. And the idea is that you have this authentic therapist-patient encounter. Again, very similar in some ways to the person-centered techniques we talked about. Vast majority of experienced therapists across ideologies employ some existential insights. And in fact, when we talk about like cognitive therapies, you'll see some of those are very similar to what we've just talked about. Now, in terms of strategies, you focus on the patient's current life situation and their unconscious fears. The therapeutic relationship in and of itself is important, engagement, connection, and then perspectives of a here and now cross-section. All right, so that's existential. Gestalt, you're going to get such a good example of when you watch Fritz Perls with Gloria. A lot of people don't enjoy watching him, just sort of heads up with that. But I think it's really good to watch him and see how different it is from the other therapies we're talking about. So the basic concepts here are holism, which asserts that humans are self-regulating and growth-oriented. Again, very similar to humanistic ideas, very similar to client-centered or person-centered ideas. And then field theory addresses how one's context influences one's experiencing. So you might be familiar with the term Gestalt from perception, right? The idea of Gestalt is looking at the whole field of vision. And that's sort of the idea that they take and apply to therapy as well. So the paradoxical theory of change asserts that the more one tries to become who you are not, the more you stay the same. So it's just not going to work if you're trying to push yourself to be something you're not. Health is a matter of being whole, again, that holistic thing, and healing occurs when you are made whole again. Organismic self-regulation requires knowing and owning what one senses, feels emotionally, observes, needs or wants, and believes. So again, the same thread of responsibility we hear in an existential. Contact means being in touch with what is emerging here and now, moment to moment. Again, similar, right? Conscious awareness is a focusing of attention on what one is in touch with. So you'll see Pearls do this with Gloria. He'll be like, why did you say this? Why did you do this gesture? That's part of it. Experimentation is the act of trying something new to increase your understanding. And again, Gestalt is like a perceptual whole or configuration of experience. So you're trying to really get someone to focus on awareness, conscious awareness. So pattern processes of awareness become the focus for the work of therapy. And you want the person to develop clarity about their thinking, feeling, decisions, and process. Awareness cultivates empowerment through access to oneself and clarifying confusions. And therapists may impart respect, compassion, and commitment. But this can also feel weird and almost abrasive. And you'll, again, see that in Pearls, I think. And here's good old Pearls. So Fritz Perls was trained as a psychiatrist. He worked with Kurt Goldstein, who was a member of the Holistic School of Psychology and studied the effects of basically what we now call traumatic brain injuries, TBIs, on World War I vets. And he was trained in psychoanalysis by Karen Horney. I think that came out Homey for some reason, but it's Horney, and Wilhelm Reich. And then his wife, Laura, was trained as a psychologist and worked with the Gestalt psychologist, Max Wertheimer. So here we have a pretty diverse training background that they brought to bear here. So in terms of the therapeutic relationship, so reality is formed in the relationship between the observed and the observer. So you're interpreting reality. So again, in that way, it's kind of like psychoanalysis. So inclusion is important. This is similar to empathetic engagement. The therapist discloses the self as authentic, congruent, transparent, and self-disclosing. So this is different than some of the other therapies we'll talk about, or you might not do as much self-disclosing. And the therapist is committed to dialogue, surrenders to what happens between the participants, tries not to control the outcome. And the ideal is that the therapist is also changed, as well as the patient. So in terms of methods, it's a blend of existential and the phenomenology of Gestalt psychology. So you take initial perceptions and you separate what's actually experienced at the moment from what was expected or logically derived. And they put aside all assumptions, all data are considered valid, and the patient's awareness is valid and should be explored. So this is a little bit distinct from some of the other therapies we've talked about, where the patient is seen as an expert, and you should really talk about that. So there are Gestalt institutes, there are associations, there are 5 English language Gestalt journals, some great resources here. Their ideas of the conscious and unconscious are different than Freud. Basically, it's awareness of what's going on and unawareness of what's going on. So the idea is in neurotic, what we now call anxious patients, some aspect of the phenomenal field is purposely and regularly regulated to the background. So you just are not aware of something going on. And then increased aspects of previously sequestered subjective states can be brought through into awareness through therapy, essentially. Health entails awareness of shifting need states and being in contact with what's actually occurring in the person-environment field. So what is going on right now, and what do we need to change to help you be mentally and physically healthy? People are inclined towards growth and will develop fully as conditions allow. Again, this is very similar to a humanistic perspective. Awareness and human relations are seen as inseparable. And ongoing movements between connection and withdrawal. Boundary disturbances include isolation, confluence, introjection, and retroflexion. So the idea here is that you're trying to help patients become aware of how they avoid learning from experience, how their self-regulatory process may be closed-ended and rather than open-ended, and how inhibitions in the area of contact limit access to the experience necessary to broaden awareness. A relationship in which the patient has another chance to learn, to unlearn, and to learn how to keep learning. So it's really seen as like a learning process. The only goal is awareness. Bring what's in unawareness to awareness. And there's active relationship and active methods, very active methods. So it's an exploration. It encourages growth and autonomy. Again, consciousness, increasing awareness. So model of engagement from the Gestalt concept of authentic contact, verbal and nonverbal. You'll see Pearls sort of picking up on Gloria's nonverbals. And then focus on present awareness and therapeutic relationship. This includes the therapist's self-disclosure that I mentioned previously. And distinguishes between merely knowing about something and owning what one is doing. And the data is the person's experience. Alrighty, so let me stop the share so that I get a little bit bigger for y'all. So that's, again, a very basic overview. Please work through the case studies, use the videos for each of those to help you out. Definitely watch Pearl's work with Gloria, watch the videos of Yalom to get an idea of existential therapy. He also does group therapy, which we haven't really seen before, so I think that's really helpful. And everyone just stay safe and stay well and take good care of yourselves.